Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Nolan McCarty, and I'm the Associate Dean of the Wilson School. And I'd like to welcome you all to this afternoon's talk, where Carter Roberts, class of '82, the President and CEO of the World Wildlife Federation, will present a public lecture entitled Animal Magnetism. Is it time to stop saving endangered species and start saving ourselves? In addition to his lecture, Roberts is spending 3 days on campus as part of the Woodrow Wilson School's program in leadership and governance, during which time he'll attend a number of lectures and meet with several students one-on-one. So we're very delighted that he's agreed to share his time and experience with us over this week. Roberts leads the World Wildlife Fund in conception and execution of cutting-edge, science-based conservation solutions. He's been working to leverage the organization's global reach and brand to help green supply chains, create markets for ecosystem services, and launch campaigns to save species and their habitats around the globe. Roberts has launched efforts with companies like the Coca-Cola Company and Procter Gamble to create more efficient business practices that use less water, energy, and land, and with NGOs like CARE and the National Resources Defense Council to build sustainable practices and better governance in Africa and the Arctic. Before ascending to his current office, Roberts was the WWF's Chief Conservation Officer since February 2004. And prior to joining the World Wildlife Foundation, Roberts spent 15 years at the Nature Conservancy, spending much of his time focused on the overall strategy and advancing its agenda. In addition to his deep experience in conservation, Roberts brings a strong background in business to his position. Earlier in his career, he led marketing and management teams at Gillette, Procter Gamble, and Dun & Bradstreet, where he advised companies including RGR, Nabisco, and Coca-Cola. He holds an MBA from Harvard University and graduated from honors from Princeton University. He currently serves on the boards of the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy at Duke and the Grantham Institute for Climate Change, a collaboration between Imperial College and the London School of Economics. Welcome to Princeton, and welcome back to Princeton.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much. Thank you. Thanks. Can you hear me? So I have 3 little kids, and I'm often, and when my oldest, who's 12 years old, is introduced me to his friends, they all have the impression that they're going to have the guy who runs the World Wrestling Federation is going to show up, and they're always disappointed when it's just me. But we actually had a lawsuit. If you watch wrestling on TV, you'll notice that it's WWE now instead of WWF, and it's because our lawyers defended this trademark. And this trademark is a funny thing. It reminds me of, I don't know how many of you are fans of Gary Larson and Gary Larson cartoons. One of my favorites has 2 deer that are hiding behind a tree. And one of them has a unique kind of birth pattern of concentric circles, and the other one, it looks just like a target, and the other one says to him, "Bummer of a birthmark, Hal," to that deer. And this is kind of our birthmark. It is who we are as an organization. When we were founded many, many years ago, it was founded by a group of people who wanted to save animals. And they all got together in London. It was a bunch of royals, scientists. One of them was doodling on a sketch pad, and they came up with the idea of raising money to save animals far, far away. This is what they look like. Not the founders. We're more diverse now, shall we say, than we were then, and this was the headlines of the paper at the time. It was a big campaign to save the black rhino from extinction. And if you know anything about black rhinos, look at that picture. That horn on that black rhino is a whopper. It's a trophy animal. It was the kind that was almost hunted to extinction, and this is what we were all about. And over the years, we grew, and we grew and grew. Each circle is the size of offices that WWF has around the world. We kept growing, and we now have 5,400 staff working in 100 countries. And when people ask me, what are you about saving fuzzy animals? I say, no, we're about a lot more than that. But animals are what animate what we do. It is, they're our point of entry into a whole complicated set of issues, and animals motivate people. They, when I speak at my 9-year-old kid's school, they are, to me, they love animals and they think that my job is pretty cool. My 12-year-old is now in a class in which the kids don't care as much about animals. I said, Christian, what do you guys talk about at school? He says, well, the other students are talking about the stock market and the economy. Which is either funny or sad when you think about they're 12 years old. But somewhere along the way, there are a lot of people who are still motivated by these magnificent creatures, whether it's the polar bear whose name, his scientific name, is the bear of the sea because it lives on the ice and it hunts what's underneath the ice. When I was in Hudson Bay looking at polar bears recently, and we looked at the ice melting much faster than it has normally, the scientist who we were talking to, we talked about, play it forward, what's going to happen to the polar bear over time. And he said, well, they'll be displaced, of course. And everyone said, well, by grizzlies? He said, no, they'll be displaced in this ecosystem by orcas. The food source of polar bears are the things that live under the ice in the sea, and they will be outcompeted by orcas who can get to that food much more easily when the ice melts. Or the tuna. How many of you read the article in the New York Times Magazine about bluefin tuna? Did any of you? One. David, a few. And this is an amazing animal. It is one of the only warm-blooded fish in the world. It has this intricate series of capillaries that enable it, through a cross-current heat exchange, to take warm blood from its heart and heat cold blood that comes from its fins, and enables it to go from tropical waters and go all the way up into the Arctic hunting and come all the way back. It is a fish that is more than a fish. Last January, one of these sold in the Tokyo Fish Exchange for $180,000. This is one of the fastest, most magnificent fish in the sea, and it's about to go extinct. Or this animal, which you may have some interest in, considering where you sit. I love this picture because it explains why a tiger has black stripes. It is the most amazing evolutionary occurrence when you see these animals in these tall grasslands and you watch them disappear. And I have all kinds of stories to tell them, looking for these in the tall grasslands in Chitwan with the Himalayas in the background, in the lowlands of Nepal. But this is a creature that has captured the imagination of people around the world. And in fact, this is, as you probably know, the Chinese Year of the Tiger. This is the year in which all the tiger range states have come together to figure out how to save this animal from extinction. There are only a little over 3,000 left in the wild, down from about 100,000 about a century ago, and they have been hunted out of their range. They have been poached. Their habitat has been destroyed. They are essentially the victim of a whole series of pressures that humanity has brought to bear on this cat. David Wilco, one of your professors, came to an event we had at the World Bank in which we had a number of investors, players, all come to a conference specifically on tigers. And there was one moment we were all crammed into a little room. The food that was left out on the buffet was gone. And David turned to me and said, so this you're trying to recreate the conditions that tigers face? No space, no food, and we're all going to go after each other to get the last carrot on the plate. And this is essentially what it is like to consider when you're trying to save tigers. We have an initiative. Tigers now are only left in a small fraction of their range in about 17 landscapes. The biggest ones are in Russia and India. And the goal of this initiative is to double their numbers by the next Year of the Tiger. And that's going to be variable. In some parts of the world, we think if you give tigers enough space and enough to eat, that their numbers will go up, like in the Terai Arc, which is in the foothills of Nepal. In other places, it's a little more flat. In Russia, they'll go up. When you get to around the Mekong, the numbers could really grow up. Those forests are pretty much empty on down the road. But this is our model. This is our business plan for bringing tigers back, for halting a precipitous decline in their numbers, and for doubling their numbers by the time the next Chinese year the tiger comes up. Now, what that will require is more than papier-mâché tigers sitting in front of a church in Moscow. But what it does require is the commitment of countries. And 2 weeks ago, Vladimir Putin, I don't know how many of you know this, hosted the first summit ever on the fate of one animal, and that was the Tiger Summit held in St. Petersburg. Putin himself is obsessed with tigers. He has been photographed bare-chested, darting tigers, collaring tigers, tracking tigers, and he pulled together other heads of state, including Wen Xiaobao, ministers throughout the range countries for this summit. He also personally invited Leonardo DiCaprio to come. And who has become an ambassador for tigers. Leonardo DiCaprio is obsessed with tigers. And I don't know what's funny about that, but for those of you who love Leo, this is a big deal. And if you stay tuned, in the next week, he will launch on his website, connected to ours, a series of 3-minute webisodes that are very personal, detailed, a description of a trip to Nepal to look for tigers with WWF. And they're very cool. They're very personal. They're not an advertisement for tigers, but at the end they really are. And the week before we took him to Nepal, this was the picture that our local staff took of a family of tigers and tiger cubs that we were surely going to see. And of course, we didn't see when we got there. But these are animals that if you give them enough space and enough time, they breed like crazy. And in fact, in Russia, in the Russian Far East, the populations of tigers were down to 40 in the 1940s. And when the government decided to get serious and shut down the poachers and govern the parks, the numbers came back up to 450, which is what they are today. So that kind of data gives you hope that you actually could save an animal like this. Another funny thing about tigers, though, is that if you want to save tigers, you've got to move beyond the beginnings of our work, which was to raise money and ship it far, far away. Because the habitats of tigers are under threat. They're under threat by cutting down trees. They're under threat by agricultural commodities like palm oil, which is in so many things that you buy every day you don't know it. They are under threat to climate change. And as a result of all that, we end up backing into, pun intended, a whole array of issues in our work to save tigers. So I often think of it that our work is like a tiger conservation triangle, that if our point of entry is to save tigers, we rapidly get into a whole set of issues that have to do with landscapes, because you've got to save the places where they exist, and then you get into a set of issues of what else lives there, and then you get into the services those landscapes provide, whether they're carbon sequestration or filtering water or pollinating crops. And then you get into issues of people, because in every single one of these landscapes, there are indigenous people who live around the edges. There are illegal poachers. There are businesses. There's a whole array of people issues around the edge of that landscape that unless you deal with them, you will surely fail. So if you take all these things and you get the mouse to work, you realize that if you're going to succeed, you've got to link together species conservation, habitat conservation, working at a national government level, and these international policies on the trade in commodities, climate agreements, and big global markets. And essentially, whether it's tigers or whether it's any other animal, you're going to fail in our work we're going to fail in our work unless we engage at all those different levels, and ultimately, unless you make all of this relevant to people. Every 2 years, we issue something called the Living Planet Report, and it has two lines. One tracks a market basket of about 1,800 species and their populations over time, and the other one tracks a comparison of humanity's demands on the planet relative to the carrying capacity of the planet. So if you look at the upper line, it's going down. That's the populations of species. That's not a good thing. And if you look at the bottom line, it's going up. And that it crossed the point at which humanity's demands on the planet were the same that the planet could sustain some time ago. And right now, we basically estimate that we demand from the planet 1.6 times what it can sustain. If you run these over time, that global footprint index is about 100% increase in the past 40 years. And the species populations have declined by about 30% in the past 40 years. The question is, what's going to happen over the next 40 years? If you break this down between temperate and tropical, where we live in this part of the world, we're looking pretty good. The temperate and the range, the band of index around populations of species is looking pretty good. But look at the tropics. The issue is all in the tropics. And that's where, if you don't blink, you will miss seeing the heart of Borneo before too long, because that forest is disappearing in front of our eyes. 60% decline in temperate populations of species since 1970. You break it down by country income group, and it's the same. The rich countries are doing well, the poor countries are doing badly in terms of biodiversity and all the values that biodiversity provides to people. This is a ranking of the global footprint, country by country. And it's an aggregate of carbon demand, land demand, water demand. And the UAE is ranked number 1. But the US is not too far behind. You can see where the world average is. You can see where certain key European countries are. You can see where China is. And then all the way down at the end is India and Indonesia. This chart is what it's really all about, which is the vertical axis is the footprint or the demands per capita that each of these country groups demands. So look at the OECD off to the left with 1.2 million people, and compare that to what the African Union to the far right, what the average person demands in terms of the carrying capacity of the planet. The next 50 years is all about that bar in the middle. It's all about the purple bar in the middle. 2.8 million people, the BRIC countries, and will they live more like us in the OECD countries, or will they find a way to use less land, energy, and water as they grow out of poverty and enjoy their new prosperity? I don't know how many of you are obsessed with this, but I can't start the day without it. If you take your average cup of latte and you break down what it takes to go in it, includes water, coffee, sugar, milk, paper, and plastic. If you estimate how much water it took to produce every single one of those components, then for an average cup of latte, you might imagine it wouldn't take much more than a liter of water. But in fact, you need the water to make the plastic lid, the water to make the cup, the water to grow the sugar, the water to produce the milk, and the water to produce the coffee beans. And by the time you're done, it takes about 200 liters of water to produce that liter, that cup that gets you through the day. The question is, as we think about what we need to sustain our own lifestyles, what are the consequences for the natural world? What does it take to produce all the things that we buy and eat? And we're increasingly becoming a lot more aware of the fact that to produce a cup of latte requires nature around the world. We just issued a report 2 years ago on coffee and where it comes from, and it got us into trouble in Indonesia because it named names on certain coffee producers that are growing coffee and buying coffee that is grown by cutting down trees in the middle of national parks in Indonesia, including those places where the tiger lives. So our goal is to make you more aware of the fact, or those companies more aware of the fact, that in their supply chains, as they pull these resources out of nature, it has certain consequences for certain things that we know and love. And to try to draw that connection on the value of nature to people and the consequences of the choice we make for nature. So most people, when they think about the footprint of a company, they think about what happens between its four walls. And in fact, the great majority of the impact of a company occurs outside of its four walls. It occurs in the way it sources all these products and the way it sells them to consumers. And in fact, companies increasingly are beginning to focus on the whole breadth of their supply chain, the whole breadth of their work, whether it's carbon emissions or water or land or whatever it happens to be. 2 weeks ago, I joined the chairman of Coke, the president of Mexico, and the chairman of Dow in Cancun to talk about a commitment that the largest consumer goods companies have made. And they announced on that day that by the year 2020, they will remove deforestation, net deforestation, from their supply chains. That they have committed, the biggest retail companies like Walmart, the biggest consumer goods companies have said, in the way that we buy whatever set of commodities it happens to be, we commit to zero net deforestation by the year 2020, which is a really big deal. Essentially, the idea is that when we buy and sell commodities, instead of just valuing them for all their physical characteristics, you value them also for all their embedded characteristics, whether it's water, poverty alleviation, labor practices, or even carbon. And you're going to begin to see when you buy items, or when Walmart buys things, or when Coke buys things from their suppliers, that they're going to be buying water, they're going to be buying carbon reduction, they're going to be buying reduced deforestation, and that all those qualities and values are going to be baked into the things that they buy and make and sell to you. And ultimately, I predict that when you buy things in a grocery store, I attended a TED conference 2 years ago in which they showed this new technology, something you can wear around your neck, that when you pick up a product, it'll scan the barcode and then project onto the product all the attributes as to how it was made. So that real time, you have the ability, somebody's shaking their head in the back of the room, you real time will have the ability to look at the attributes of all these things. When I was in Beijing 3 years ago, I went into a Carrefour market, picked up a head of lettuce, stuck it into a barcode scanner, and it told me who grew it, how it was grown, who shipped it to market, when it arrived, and all that information is increasingly going to be at your fingertips. The sad thing is nobody will pay more for that in general. But if the price is the same, it's pretty clear what people will choose. The way we approach all this is to think about if we want to save nature for not just for animals, but also for people, what's the point of leverage? Where do you get leverage? You can either try to influence the buying patterns of what will be 9 billion people, or you can try to influence the production patterns of 1.5 billion producers around the world. What we've decided to do is to focus on about 500 companies in the middle that control and leverage the markets of all these commodities and how they're bought and sold. So put another way, we've gone around the world and looked at all these places that we care about, identified a suite of commodities, and then identified the top 10 companies that have the greatest influence and power for how each one is created and sold. And we are now working with those companies to secure commitments that they will only buy those products if they're grown in a certified, sustainable way. Or if you can't read that, here's a color version. Now, when I stand in front of the leadership of Kraft or Cargill and I show this slide, you can hear a pin drop in the room because these companies, more than anything else, are obsessed with their brands. They're obsessed with their reputation. And the last thing they want is for people to equate buying a cup of latte with driving a tiger to extinction. And so they are all, well, not all of them, but a lot of them are now beginning to move in this direction. And our theory of change is that in most of these countries, we are unable to get the governments to regulate the right thing on the ground. If we can get enough of these companies, a threshold mass of these companies who have brands and who care about the issue, to commit to move in a certain direction, then they will drive the government to put in place the right regulation to bring along the laggards. That's what we're trying to do in our work around all these issues. Now, I want to talk about another set of issues, and I talked to David about putting this up. He said, don't put this up. It's the logos of other universities. But this is a partnership that we have with Stanford University and the Nature Conservancy called the Natural Capital Project. It is all about trying to capture the value of nature, not for fuzzy animals, but for us. And it's all about developing tools and putting them to application to capture the value of nature and then actually get that into practice. And a couple of things that we've done. We talk about tigers. An amazing thing happened about 2 years ago, which is the governors of the island of Sumatra all came together and said, we commit to work together to map all the values of nature on this island and then to make choices for land use based on that. And they asked WWF, along with other groups, to create the scientific database to enable them to do that. So we've now begun to map carbon stored, water yield, and other variables as an input to that. And guess what? The overlap with tiger habitat in some of these areas is extraordinary. So what will happen is if we can find a way to capture those values, not just in the way the government decides to plant things in certain places, but also to capture those values for future carbon markets or for water markets, then we might just have a chance of saving the habitat for tigers too. You probably are all aware of the fact that the government of Norway has now committed $1 billion to the government of Indonesia to pay it to manage deforestation, to reduce CO2 emissions. And it is basically a pay-as-you-go, that you demonstrate in a monitoring regime how you're doing in reducing deforestation in these areas and reducing carbon released, and we will pay you for that over time. And this kind of tool is incredibly valuable in connecting up to those sources of payments. One of the challenges in measuring forests, if you all think about the maps that if you take out a road map and you want to see where the local park is, you just see a blob of green. It's either developed or non-developed. And the blob of green for parks is the way we used to map forests. With carbon markets, what you want to do, if you want to figure out how much carbon is left in the trees, and that requires knowing how tall the trees are, how many of them are there year by year. And another tool that we're beginning to use in association with the Carnegie Institute is to take laser images from a small plane flying back and forth over a forest, synced up with measurements on the ground to develop an algorithm that can be combined with satellite images to evaluate not just forest cover, but forest canopy and forest height. So you can calculate to a very, very finite, to a very, very refined ability to measure the amount of carbon in a forest and to repeat this year after year after year and compensate a government accordingly. Do you have more forest, less forest, more carbon on the ground, or less? And this program called LIDAR is one of the real breakthroughs in our work right now, the ability to measure forests and the amount of carbon stored within. Another tool is evaluating the value of fisheries. And you've all heard about marine protected areas, essentially parks in the sea, which have been proven if you design them right, if they're at the right scale, will actually generate more fish for local communities than if they weren't there at all. And we've begun to do some work through the Natural Capital Project in the Gulf of California to evaluate the value of mangroves. And how many more fish do you catch if you leave the mangroves intact as opposed to destroying them? And to run models to establish the value per hectare of mangroves, which turns out to be about $37,000 per hectare of mangroves if you leave them intact. About 3 weeks ago, I was off the coast of Mozambique with the CEO of CARE, Helene Gale. We were asked by communities in Mozambique to help them design and establish marine protected areas because their coasts had been stripped clean. They were left with fish catch that were fish about this size, and they had asked for help in protecting their resource. And the government of Mozambique has worked with us to give them the rights to monitor marine fisheries, to establish marine protected areas, to set up guards around those areas with walkie-talkies that can call in planes to identify boats that are coming in illegally and to bring in boats to arrest them. And this is one of the most powerful tools in our work, which is giving communities the rights to their natural resources, to monitor those resources. Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize for her work on this issue, has detailed how when communities have an interest in a natural resource and monitor that resource typically recovers much faster than most other models. So, one last example. This is one of the coolest animals on Earth. It's the oryx. I was just in Namibia, and we were talking about the oryx and how the oryx works. The oryx has a face that is half black and half white. The scientists who were there described and the effect that because of the color difference, it creates a temperature gradient on the surface of their face that creates kind of like a mini breeze that helps cool the brain of the oryx. The oryx also has black stripes under its eyes that reduce reflection for the sun. It also has a system of capillaries in its brain, below its brain, that enables the rest of the body to become red hot but keep the brain cool enough to survive. The oryx also happens to be an incredible trophy for anyone who wants to go hunting. 17 years ago, when the government in Namibia became independent, it created in its constitution the right for local communities to govern their natural resources. They don't own the land, but they have the right to own and sell the wildlife. Previously, they had been killing lions and cheetahs and elephants and anything else because it affected their water sources, it killed their goats. And so the wildlife populations in Namibia, at about the time of independence, were rock bottom. What happened was these communities, with some outside help, began to negotiate agreements with lodges, wilderness safari lodges, with hunting concessions, and in return got a portion of the revenues. And because the wildlife had value to them, either being shot or being photographed, they stopped killing the wildlife. And the result 17 years later is it is the one place on Earth that I've seen where the wildlife populations are soaring. It is a dramatic recovery, and the communities have money in the bank for the first time. But it is because they placed an economic value on creatures like the oryx. And not just in an emotional sense. Part of the economic value was also selling hunting permits as well. The Natural Capital Project, the areas in green are the area where these community conservancies cover in Namibia. There are 55 of them. They cover a huge percentage of the country. And if you look at, on the right-hand side, this is some research that we've done on conservancy income relative to the number of different species found in each conservancy. And that establishes the value not just for saving one species, but the whole suite of species that are in that area. So when I reflect on all of this and the work that we're doing, what's become clear to me is even though we got into this business to save animals, that more and more our work is about saving species. And about saving us, not one species, Homo sapiens. I'll never forget a talk that I heard from Stephen Jay Gould. You all know who Stephen Jay Gould is, the famous paleontologist. And he gave this talk, and I'll never forget, before he died, he stretched out his arms. He said, if you look at the entirety of human history, or history of the planet, rather, all the way back to the beginning of time, the amount of time that humanity has been on the planet is about the shaving off of one of my fingertips. And he said at the time, I am really annoyed that you keep talking about saving the planet. The planet is going to be fine. It's just going to turn into something that you don't like. If you're smart, you should start talking about saving yourselves. You'll be able to raise a lot more money. You'll also be able to create much better mechanisms to save these things that you care about. And by the way, you'll be a lot more honest, because at the end of the day, the planet's going to turn into something else. The question is it something that not only you care about, but supports your way of life? And so increasingly in our work, the type of science and the type of work that we do may start with an animal, but it quickly gets to the economics of that animal and its habitat. It quickly gets to developing markets for that place. And it quickly becomes apparent to me and to all the people who work at WWF that we're not likely to succeed unless we get on with it, to capture those values, not just in research papers, but to get them into use by the World Bank or by climate conventions or by companies in designing products they make, in creating compensation schemes, or in giving communities certain mechanisms to make money off of nature. So when I put together the title for this talk, I thought, God, this is a little disingenuous. Of course, actually, I wonder if we could, this has got great Russian music in the background. At the end of the day, of course, we're not going to give up on saving species. But as a forcing mechanism to get at the value of nature to humanity, they have a way of focusing our attention on a few places and getting after the issues that I've talked about. You may not be like Vladimir Putin or Leonardo DiCaprio. You may not be obsessed with these cats. But at least you can help us figure out how to quantify the value of nature for food or for ecosystem services, and to get that into the policy frameworks that we care about. Thank you. Happy to take any questions. Or I have 6 cups of water that I could offer to people on a first-come, first-served basis. Yes?
Thank you so much. How has this approach changed your sort of marketing or fundraising mechanism so far, or has it not? Is it still very much animal focused?
Okay, well, this gets back to the bummer of a birthmark, Hal, right? Because our brand, World Wildlife Fund, our logo, is kind of hard to start in any other place but animals for us. It is, people expect us to talk about animals. What's interesting is we just did a lot of market research, and we discovered that our members or decision makers in Washington always expect us to start with animals, but they are really willing and ready to hear about all the other things that go into saving them, all the way out to the markets and the values that I've talked about. The one thing where the market research got a little stuck was on the issue of climate change, which was interesting. Making the jump to why we do so much work on climate change was harder, because it's become such an abstraction. It's become something that people don't see. So it's really curious to me that when we did the research, getting people all the way from a species to how Coca-Cola sources sugar is easy. Getting them to think about climate change was hard. And so I think that's one of the great challenges for us, is to describe why climate change is hammering things that we care about, whether it's ocean acidification or sea level rise or change in precipitation patterns. But what we've learned through all this is we still have to start with animals. People have a huge appetite for getting to all the other issues pretty quickly. Yes?
If I want to buy something and I have a choice to go to Walmart or go to some of its competitors, and why would I go to Walmart, say, if it's more committed, say, to conserving natural resources, where the vast majority of the public are not aware of this lecture and
Yeah.
the fact that Walmart wants to be green?
Well, you should go to Walmart because you want the good guys to get more business. So,
Yeah, me.
yeah. But individually, you should give the guys who care about these issues your business more than the guys who don't. It was interesting. I sat it's interesting. European retailers compete on this much more than American ones do, because the European consumers buy more on this basis than American consumers do. What's interesting about Walmart is they are as much doing the right thing on the set of issues because they believe it makes good business sense. They're thinking about, will they have more fish to sell in the future? Will they have more of these items? They're also doing it because the Walton family is obsessed with this stuff. The same with the Mars family. They're a privately owned company. They're doing more than any other company. They don't even talk about it, but they are obsessed with this stuff. What we're seeing is more and more companies Coke and Pepsi are now competing to own the water steward space. They want to outdo each other on the water issue. We're beginning to see more and more companies do this, in part because the biggest companies have to navigate different regulatory regimes in different countries. They want to have an advantage in having a relationship with those governments in different countries. Because when they all run the clock forward, what they're looking at is their supply chain, and will they still be able to get that stuff when there are 9 billion people on the planet and people are competing over it. And so the companies that are thinking ahead are thinking, I got to be a leader on this issue. I've got to lock this up. I've got to get ahead on this issue. And some believe that by inventing approaches or processes or procedures that are more efficient, they can sell those to other companies as well. Right now, in terms of the certified market, about 6% of forest stewardship of timber is certified according to FSC. About 11% of seafood is certified. Commodities are in different places, but our goal is to tip all those markets towards certified sustainability. We see a lot more traction there than with governments right now, believe it or not. But for you, I'd shop at Walmart. The prices are lower. They're greener. They may not be perfect, but at least on this set of issues, they're about as good as it gets. Besides, A&P just declared bankruptcy, and they own Pathmark, which is probably where you go. Yes?
I'm wondering about the monitoring and verification needed to scale up the certified product industry. I mean,
Yeah.
I want to believe that Walmart, in its heart and in its business model, wants all of their products to be sustainable, but it seems like is WWF part of the making sure that there's third-party verification?
Yeah, it's all about trust but verify, right? And companies at the end of the day are driven by the profit motive as much as anything else. They're also driven by reputation. There are lots of people who want to do good things, but you've got to verify, which is why we, on all these certification schemes, we are creating third parties who do the certifying. When you go to the southeastern edge of the Amazon and you look at beef and soy production, Brazil is working on satellite imagery that keys out pixels right down to the hectare, that tracks deforestation and all of those properties. And then we're beginning to be able to attribute to a side of beef or a bushel of soy the attributes of where it was grown and whether trees were cut down. And that's all beginning to happen. If it's a company with a brand, then they're really nervous about that. I don't know how many of you saw the Greenpeace ad about Nestle and Kit Kat bars. Has anybody seen that? Where essentially, picture an ad in Europe. There's a nice, clean office setting. Young guy's working on his computer. He takes a Kit Kat bar. He opens it up. He breaks off one. He eats it. And then his boss comes in the room, and he's looking at his boss, and he breaks off the other without looking and puts it in his mouth. And it turns out it's the finger of an orangutan. Because Kit Kat bars include palm oil from Borneo that resulted in deforestation. And then while the boss is waving to him, he bites into it, and blood comes down his face and over his shirt. And the headline is, Stop Nestle from Killing Orangutans in Borneo. And then the final scene has the website you can go to write to Nestle. And it's superimposed over the keyboard with that finger, and a pool of blood is spreading out. So Nestle, one of the biggest companies in the world, declared a moratorium on palm oil from Borneo not too long thereafter. And so companies that have brands are worried. The real interesting question is, what about the companies without brands? Because as much as we've got that list of brands on the screen, what about China? What about India? What about companies? We don't even know the names of these companies that are sourcing palm oil. How do you get traction with those? How do you monitor those? How do you track those over time? And that becomes one of the most interesting questions. And we're still, if anybody in the room has the answer for that question, please talk to me afterwards. That's one of the most interesting set of issues, is those companies that aren't branded, that don't have shareholders, that how do we get agreements with them? How do we monitor them? And how do we get a handle on what's happening? But this is a big deal. This is why the number one issue for the U.S. in Cancun over the past 2 weeks was MRV, monitoring and verification. And they eventually, Todd Stern dug in his heels, and he eventually got what he wanted. It's the commitment from other countries to be monitored. Yes?
I just find it funny to hear about Walmart being called the good guy.
Yeah.
Because it's just an interesting, to me, contrast between a global 30,000-foot view of a company and its supply chain, but when you're working more on a local level with species protection, and what comes out the other side of Walmart. For example, in New Jersey, they're still ruining, plain snake habitat, endangered species habitat. They're constantly looking for permits to build on their species habitat in New Jersey. So while we might laud them for this 30,000-foot, very important biodiversity protection, that these temperate areas, these that are doing okay, are still suffering from their practices.
Yeah. So guess what? Nobody's perfect, right? And actually, on anything that I've presented today, everything that I've presented today has some warts. Everything. And we were talking about it earlier with over lunch, that I don't care whether it's New Jersey or the Amazon or Borneo, there are choices we have to make. What do we value more? Water or carbon, biodiversity, human livelihoods? I mean, ideally all these things line up, but they don't always. And a lot of what we need is really good science. So you can put these attributes on the table and know what the consequences are of the choices that you make. You would rather live in New Jersey than in Borneo, I guarantee you, in terms of conservation of habitat. But I don't mean to be an apologist for Walmart. They have big stores. They put them in rural areas. and that has consequences. But the places that we are working on, when Walmart says, we will only source certified seafood, it makes headlines in the fishing press. And everybody starts scrambling to, how do we think about either cod or hoki or salmon, and do we have enough protected areas? Are we managing it according to ecosystem principles? It has huge leverage. So if I can think of a way to help you with the New Jersey pine barrens and the habitat there, I will.
I'm the executive director of Conserve Wildlife Foundation.
We can talk afterwards. So, yeah, I mean, it gets back to the monitoring question. You should never, I mean, the thing for us and all the work we do with companies is it's all about creating targets, setting measurable targets, and evaluating targets over time. And we reserve the right to say, hey, you're not hitting the target. And we reserve the right to disagree publicly. But working with these companies, we're seeing a lot more traction on certain issues like pulling carbon out of supply chains than we are with the U.S. Senate right now. And so we're going after results where we can get them. And I actually think with Senate, with Congress, the voice of business, do not underestimate the voice of business when we eventually get to a climate bill. You know, nobody's going to ask me a question after the Kit Kat ad description, but I'm happy to take some more. Yes?
Well, that was my question. If corporations are looking in the long term and realizing that they have to change things because of climate change, why aren't they influencing government more, particularly in Europe?
Yeah, it was actually, you know, it was interesting. I was sitting in this great coffee shop this morning, and the guy next to me was talking about climate change and storytelling, and I looked over, and it was you.
Oh.
I couldn't get any work done, actually. What's interesting is if you talk to, I was talking to some Republican policymakers last week, and one of them said, yeah, we've heard from GE, we've heard from all the good guys, but at the end of the day, the oil and coal companies won the day. And what we've gotten is progressive companies to lend their voice on the issue. But if you still look at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and if you still look at, you know, the key votes in the Senate, there's still a host of other companies that just don't get it, that are pouring tons of money into misinformation, and frankly, we got outmaneuvered. And so there is no question that in addition to working with these companies and getting them to send the message that they need a regulatory framework to support doing the right thing, I think we also, if and when we create climate legislation in the U.S., it will be the result of starting a movement where people are not just thinking about creating new jobs, but they're afraid. And we're going to have to tell stories, and we're going to have to create campaigns, just as well as the NRA develops a movement that keeps handgun legislation off the books. We're going to have to create a political force so that the White House and the Senate take the environmental movement more seriously than it does.
Fear for good.
Well, look, I mean, climate change at the end of the day, it's not about certainty, it's about risk. It's about these horrific scenarios and that have enormous consequences for people in our economy. And we need to make people aware of that. And we got to find the right way to tell the story. So far, I don't think we figured out the right way to tell the stories. So yeah, fear for good. Fear sells in politics, by the way. Fear for good. Yeah, we'll work on that. Any other questions? Yes?
Time magazine this year, had an article about the great mass extinction that can occur over the next 100 years. That's what they say. Where just a startling number of species
extinct in the next 100 years or so.
Yeah.
Obviously, and they pointed to this, that you can't save every animal or every species. Are you prioritizing your efforts strictly based on economic factors about how much you think the tiger is so beautiful versus the 1,000 other species that are important, but they don't have the same brand recognition?
Yeah, actually, it's been turned off. But we actually went through a process of figuring out what our priorities are. And 6 years ago, we were smeared all over the world. We had 2,000 little projects going all over the world, and we decided that two things. One is that if we did that many little projects, we probably weren't going to make a difference anywhere, that we needed a critical mass in each. And the other one was, given who we are and our global reach, that it would be better to pick places where you had species and places that were a great platform for getting a handle on these big global drivers of change. And so we took 865 terrestrial ecoregions, lumped them down into about 26 major habitat types, and then ranked them within each major habitat type. Like a major habitat type would be like temperate forest or tropical forest. And then high-graded the richest ones, the ones with the most species, within each major habitat type, lumped a few, and then we ended up with about 20 places. The Amazon, the Congo, the Arctic, Chihuahuan Desert, coastal East Africa, the Coral Triangle, and the Philippines and Indonesia. And within each one, we committed to start with species, but get to these big ecosystems and ecosystem services, and then get after these big global drivers. So that was kind of our algorithm. That was our sorting process. We didn't start with the tiger.
You don't start with the tiger and work down.
We didn't start with a bluefin. We started off with the whole. If our job is to protect the diversity of life on Earth and to build a future in which people live in harmony with nature, where do you get the biggest bang for your buck in terms of species? And then where do you get the biggest platform for trying to define new models for production that don't destroy the planet? That was our approach. And the thing about 20 is some of them are going really well. Some of them are not going quite so well. But 20 is enough where you at least have a nice portfolio. Yes?
I was quite interested in this sort of relatively economic way of seeing nature and making sense of nature to humans by putting a value on it. Is that something that either has given you more traction, do you think, with the companies that you engage with, or has it come out of your engagement with companies as sort of a response to needing to speak in a language that decision makers understand?
In part, I think it actually comes from a much longer history of people wanting to put a value on nature. But Bob Costanza started a lot of this work. There have been a lot of people who've done this work. There's been a lot of good research done on it. Where, New York City is, everyone knows the New York City case where they could have spent billions on a water filtration plant, but instead they saved the Catskills because it was a much cheaper way of filtering the water that gets to New York City. In fact, New York City has like the cleanest water of almost any city in the country. That wouldn't have happened, by the way, without a regulatory framework. And so when you think about ecosystem services, it's not just because it makes sense. It really takes off when you have a regulatory framework to drive that concept. Or if you get a country to say, I'm going to use this concept to manage land in Sumatra. Or when you get a company to say, I'm going to use this to make decisions on how I buy the raw materials for my products. So there's been a lot of great research done on ecosystem services. The real where we've gotten stuck is putting it into practice so that the World Bank, the government of Namibia, or Walmart actually uses those concepts, and so it's all of the above. Where I think we're mostly stuck is in getting governments to say, this is fundamental to how we plan our land use and our economies. Some have got it. Costa Rica, Bhutan, Even Nepal got it. And a lot of them are chasing carbon money now. So now you're beginning to see a lot of mapping of forests. And I think we'll see more and more of this as natural resources become more finite and people start fighting over them. People are starting to leave. One last question. Anybody got? Yes.
I really enjoyed your presentation. I wanted to say that, people often seem to misunderstand the animal as a part of the food chain. I mean, the tiger, it's not only its symbol, also it's because of the way ecosystems work. It's the top of the food chain, so it's dependent on so many little factors. It's actually a very good measure of how the ecosystem is working. So that's, of course, why you get the triangle picture and you actually look at every little aspect. And so if you're protecting the tiger, you're actually protecting everything. And that's the way the scientists have figured it out. But what I wanted to compare that with is, Kit Kat. I mean, of course, Kit Kat just one brand that Nestle produces. There's tons of others that go on common. And so, but with false advertising, you could end up, everyone feels guilty about eating Kit Kat. But Kit Kat is not an issue. It's a company. And I was wondering how the good guys work, but I found this being about keeping the scientists on top of what's happening. Because it's great to bring it. First, you need the scientific facts, then the economic market forces, and you can quantify that.
Yeah.
But the advertising, what's winning your battle? It's great that it won the battle, but
No, it wasn't.
keep it accurate.
Well, it wasn't our ad, for the record. Okay. It made us look really reasonable by comparison. Yeah, so it's interesting. We have a couple of hundred people on staff who do nothing but work on these commodities, define certification programs, work on roundtables, science-based efforts, and we leave that kind of stuff to other groups. Although they do have their place in the ecosystem of environmental movement. I mean, you can't deny that. I wanted to say one last thing before, what you said about the tiger is really true. It's also true about tuna. It's true about polar bears. It's true about a lot of these guys. Is if you get a big enough animal, then you have to protect large landscapes, seascapes, habitats, and it makes your job harder. But ultimately, the other thing is they also just capture people's imagination. There's something, I don't know why Putin is obsessed with tigers. Actually, I have some theories. Why he is. But a lot of people are.
I was 10 years old and I was soaked to the skin for 4 hours and a tiger just ran across us. It was the most heavenly moment.
All right, well, you got one on me. So you're lucky, it's, but I think what's interesting to me is the type of science, the type of research that we need right now is not unidimensional. It crosses ecology and economics and politics. Somebody asked me today, what's the best place to start your career if you get into this field? I mean, if you want to save the planet. Should you start it in business or an NGO or government or in a university? And of course my answer is it doesn't matter. But the rarest commodity that we have in our work are people who can connect the dots. It's people who know how to pull together leaders in civil society with the right people at the right level in a government agency, with the right people and the right businesses to craft a solution. The people we have, and we're beginning to hire more and more of them, have more often than not worked in more than one of those sectors. And they think in more than one of those sectors. They can think about what is the right thing for a business, in addition to what would save the heart of Borneo. And people who do that kind of research or design those kind of careers are like gold. They are the most successful people in our work are the people who can do that. So if anybody's thinking about your careers, and I think that's just something to think about. My role models are people like John Sawhill, who hired me for my first job at TNC. He worked in a university. He was president of NYU at the ripe age of 39. He left and went to work in the Department of Energy in Washington. And then he left and became the head of the Nature Conservancy. And then he went back to teaching at Harvard Business School. And he kept just bouncing back and forth between these sectors. And he had the ability to bring together the right players at the right time. And more often than not, big legislation is not going to move without business. And governments aren't going to move without knowing that civil society isn't going to whack them. And so the ability to think about those different perspectives and to have good science that crosses different disciplines is profoundly important to our work. And it's where we get stuck is when we don't have that. So anyway, thank you very much. It's really been a pleasure.